show you. This event is organised by Modern Church, and I'm the General Secretary of Modern Church. My name's Alison Webster. And just if you haven't come across Modern Church before, just to let you know, we are an ecumenical, progressive, theological group, being open around all issues of theology and exploration of theology. We're 125 years old, but I hope we're constantly reinventing ourselves. And this evening is one of a series of events that we have, panels, lectures, conversations with key people who are doing exciting exploration around theological issues. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also to our blog, and to visit our website and explore a lot of the material that we have on there, which is modernchurch.org.uk. It's great that you're joining us tonight, and if you're watching this later, thank you. Great to have you joining the conversation around deconstructing whiteness, and focusing on this book, Deconstructing, Whiteness, Empire and Mission, which is co-edited by Anthony Reddie and Carol Troupe, both of which are with us this evening, along with Angela Sheard, Ruth Harley and Al Barrett. Ruth and Al are both contributors as well to this book. Angela is, well, I'll introduce everybody in more detail as we go along, as they contribute. So this is a theme, a theological theme, that I think personally I've been waiting to see explored in depth, or have been wanting to be part of exploring in depth for a very long time. Anthony talks in his introductory chapter about going back 25 years or so to his days, studying theology as an undergraduate. And I want to just use some quotes from him in this introduction, because I very much resonated with what Anthony has said in his introductory chapter. And also, you know, we're of the same vintage, so mid-80s, studying theology. And you say, Anthony, we spent a great deal of time looking at the writer, and you were doing church history, looking at the writings of great luminaries such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, among others. At no point were they ever racialized, that is, ever described as white authors or white thinkers. These individuals were simply authors and thinkers. Their ideas were generic, and most importantly, they had universal implications for all peoples. Or so we were taught, right? Yes, absolutely resonate with that completely. And I think for me, then doing gender studies in the mid-90s, which is quite a long time ago now, you know, that's nearly 30 years ago. And then coming across film studies and gender studies, where whiteness and critical white studies was much more a part of the landscape. But yet, theologically, it wasn't. And as you say, it remains in its infancy within academic theology and theological education. And it shouldn't be in its infancy, but it is in its infancy. And what you said, Anthony, is what I'm interested in and trying to assert in this exploratory chapter are the ways in which whiteness operates as a tacit, concealed form of normative framing for what we have come to know as truth. So it's that whole sense of there are hidden value systems, expectations, assumptions about what is normative, and so much that's invisible. And that's invisible to particularly those of us who are white and are engaging theologically. So I'm so excited by this book. I can't claim to have read it all yet. I will, and I urge other people to. But the chapters I've read, to observe particularly, and as a feminist, you'll appreciate this as well, white men being self-reflexive in the way that they're thinking about their own role, particularly in academic theology. It's so refreshing, and I just want to thank you two editors before we do anything else for putting together this collection. There's so much in it. There's so much that we need to engage with. We need to take further. We need to support one another in doing, and that's really the theme for this evening. And I'm so delighted that you've all agreed to be part of that. Anthony and Carol, the co-editors, are going to speak for 10 minutes or so about, or split between them, about introducing the book, why you thought it was important, why you've done this amazing piece of work. And then our other three contributors will each speak for 5 minutes about why deconstructing whiteness is important to them. And then we'll have more of a conversation. Those of you in YouTube land, please contribute if you have thoughts, comments, questions. Do put them in the chat function there, and they will wind their way by the wonders of technology back to us, and I can pitch those in at appropriate moments. So do feel able to be part of this. So Anthony, Carol, which of you would like to go first to talk to us about the book itself?
Okay.
Carol,
is that okay? I'll go first. Why this book? I think, well, obviously there was the Whiteness conference that was held via the OCRC at Regent's Park College, and the special issue of Practical Theology. But I think for the book, it was just trying to capture a moment in theological thinking, practice, whatever, because I'm sure everyone's aware, and I know Al mentioned this when I spoke to him, and probably Ruth as well, that these aren't things that haven't been, and you've alluded to it as well, these are the things that haven't just come out of nowhere all of a sudden. These are things that have been spoken about, especially in Black theology, for decades or longer. But I think for whatever, well, we all know what all the things that took place in 2020, and it seemed that suddenly there was a kind of awakening, I suppose you could call it, a realization. And I think it was important to capture that moment. And kind of, I think it's important to have that snapshot so that we have something to build on, because otherwise it's just a moment that passes and then we go on our merry way. I think it's important that this is just the beginning of a conversation, and it's not even the beginning, because as I said, it's been talked about for a long time, but it's just marking that moment and hoping that it, you know, continues to develop, because I think it's an ongoing conversation, and we can't just say, okay, it's done now, and kind of let things drift. And it's also about hoping to influence practice, because it's one thing to write about it, but you also have to live it. So hopefully it will lead to a kind of change in practice as well. And I came to be involved in this through my work as a research associate. It was originally funded by CWM to do some work on the archives, the Mission Magazine archives. So that was how I came to be involved in this as part of my role. So there's probably more I could say, but I'll leave Anthony to fill in the blanks.
Anthony, go ahead. Also, I want to make sure that everybody hears the people may not be familiar with the Deconstructing Whiteness, I think that was what it was all, conference, or the special issue of Practical Theology, which they may be able to get. And it sounds as though CWM, which is Conference for World Mission, is doing some important work in this area. So Anthony, could you cover that as well when you in your introduction? Thank you.
Yeah, so the conference was actually called Dismantling Whiteness, which itself was very, very contentious, and there was quite a lot of pushback on social media. At one point, a complaint was sent to the police because that someone complained that the conference was an infringement of like the Human Rights Act in terms of also promoting racism. In my response, I did have to make the point that it was actually a white colleague. It was like Jill Marsh, was one of the contributors of the book. It was actually her title called it was actually her title in terms of called Dismantling Whiteness. That would have been April 2021. And a special issue of Practical Theology then sort of took the best of those papers, which were then published in a special issue that was co-edited by Jill Marsh and Al Babbitt. In one sense, doing the book was a contractual agreement or arrangement. So one of the things that we had said that we would do when we were funded by the Council for World Mission is that we would produce a book. So in one sense, it was done in order to fulfill what we said we would do in terms of getting the funding from them. But what I think also prompted the book for me was I worked briefly for the Council for World Mission for 10 months in 2019 before I got the job in Oxford. And I remember, and I think Al might have been there was a consultation at the URC headquarters, would have been late 2019. And there were two groups. One group involved myself looking at the archives at SOAS, and then there was another group of which I think Al was a member, that was a very tentative conversation actually looking at whiteness. And what struck me when I came at the back end of that was there's this tension between, there were a number of, and obviously I'll be very English and of course I shall not name names, but there were some very, very prominent anti-racist activists who were there, who in many respects have been brilliant stalwarts in terms of anti-racist activism, in terms of fighting systemic injustice. So it's not to question their ethics or to question their commitment. But what they struggled with was that they were very, very good at telling everyone what they had done in terms of fighting racism, but utterly hopeless in being reflexive around their whiteness and particularly around their masculinity. So when we were trying to say, yes, okay, it's really good to tell us what we should do and what you have done, but what about your own privilege? So the very fact that you can stand up and in some cases write a book and tell people about racism is precisely because of your lived privilege that those who are largely on the other end of racism who face it directly, for the most part, don't write books about it because they don't have the opportunity to do so. The conversation kind of crashed and burned, basically, because we just couldn't get past the inability of several of these individuals to own their whiteness. And I think for me, that's where the seeds of the book really came in. So I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, if myself and Carol are obliged to produce something as part of the outcomes of the funding, then what I want is not just to talk about racism as if somehow that is just perpetuated by individuals who sort of fell out of the sky from space kind of thing and have just kind of sort of materialized and then dematerialized as if they don't exist. It's real people, it's flesh and blood people, sometimes well-meaning, sometimes not so well-meaning, who help to perpetuate racism. And so it was trying to say, to have a book that was not just anti-racist, like we've had lots of anti-racist books, well, actually not lots, but we've had some anti-racist books before. But we haven't had many in which white people have been asked to reflect critically on what it means to be racialized as being white. Black people have been doing this for decades. We have been writing about blackness and the problems of being blackness because we've had no choice. White people have not had to do it and therefore they haven't done it, particularly, certainly within theology until now. And so that really was the book that we tried to produce with Carol and I. And we were wonderfully served by a whole set of people who were very honest. Obviously I won't say so much about what the contributors have done because we've actually got two of the best of them with us and they will speak for themselves. But But certainly, as Carol said, it was a book of its time. It seemed at this moment it was possible to get this conversation going. And one of the things I'm hoping, as Carol has said, is that it will kickstart a movement in a whole number of ways. There's, I think, just two very, very quick ones. One is a development of a theological movement called critical white theology. So we've had black theology for the best part of 50 odd years, which is theologizing on the nature of blackness and black experience. What we've not had are comparative work on the thinking around whiteness in a similar kind of intentional way. And I'm hoping that our book will kickstart a movement of critical white theology. But as Carol also says, it's then also about practice, because if what comes from this is just lots and lots of more books, but nothing actually changes on the ground in terms of how we do church, how we do community relationships, how we think about activism, then clearly like we will have missed something quite important. So it's also about how we are thinking about practice and what does it mean to be church, and particularly when we think about mission in the context of church, and how can we do that that is alive to the legacies of the past.
Thank you, Anthony. That's a really good set of agenda setting issues, and thank you, Carol, as well, for saying more about, I think this thing about it being the moment and the right moment with Black Lives Matter, and this sort of renewed sense that things have got to change. And between you, you've also highlighted, you know, some of the obstacles to change being that those of us who are white are not doing the work and haven't been doing the work, and we need to do the work. So so practice, critical white theology, looking at ways of being church, fantastic. And I know that over the next hour and a half, we'll be very much covering all those bases, I hope. So let's move to some of the contributors to the book. And Anthony, I did mean to say at the beginning, in introducing you, that you are, because I just love to say it, the Professor of Black Theology at Oxford University. Just hear those words, you know, because just so fantastic. On the one hand, such a scandal that it's taken so long. On the other hand, but we all, I'm sure, I'm seeing lots of nods because I can see everyone at once, which nobody else can. But yeah, so that's great. So we have discussed who's going to go first, but I'm looking at Ruth. So Ruth Harley is a curate in Milton Keynes, Watling Valley Ecumenical Partnership, and has written widely on a range of issues, but is a contributor with Al to this book. So Ruth, over to you for 5 minutes or so on that question of why, what does deconstructing whiteness mean to you, and why is it important?
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, it's really good to be part of this conversation and to have been part of this book. That question, what does deconstructing whiteness mean to you? I mean, there's all manner of answers that I could give to that, ranging from the academic to the very practical. But as I was thinking about it, a phrase that came to me was that for me, deconstructing whiteness is in a sense an apocalyptic task. Hear me out on that one. Apocalypse, meaning a revelation of something, but a revelation that is also transformative. So in what sense is deconstructing whiteness apocalyptic? In what sense is it a revelation, and a revelation to whom? I think often work which uncovers privilege of any description, in this case white privilege, is apocalyptic to the people who have that privilege. It is a revelation to those of us who did not previously realise the privilege that we have. It is not a revelation, generally speaking, to the people on the underside of that dynamic of privilege and oppression. So deconstructing whiteness, for me personally, and I think for those of us who are white theologians and practitioners trying to engage with this work, has been apocalyptic, it has been revelatory, it continues to be. Sometimes that revelation is slow, painfully slow, I'm sure some of my Black colleagues would tell me, and sometimes it's sudden. But it is a revelatory thing. So then what do we do with that revelation? Because all revelation should lead to some sort of transformative action if we believe that revelation is divinely inspired, which I really think it is. For me, I think one of the really strong themes that comes out of this book is around not just anti-racism, as if that isn't a big enough and important enough thing to engage with in its own right, which it absolutely is, but there's something deeper, there's something at the roots of that, something deeper and more radical in the sense of rooted, about moving away from paradigms of mastery and self-sufficiency and control, moving away from what Anthony wonderfully describes as the generic universalism of whiteness, that assumption that the white perspective is in any sense universal and uncontextual. There's no such thing as an uncontextual perspective. So then what do we do with that? I think that is a huge question, and I hope we'll broaden that out as we go on. But for me, one of the key things in thinking about how we move forward with that work of deconstructing whiteness, and I'm thinking particularly in a kind of local church context, because that's where I spend most of my time. For me, it's something about formation. Now, formation gets quite a lot of attention in this book in an academic sense and in a ministerial formation sense. But I want to think too, and perhaps actually particularly, about formation of individuals and of communities within the local church and beyond the local church, within our local communities. I think for me, where I am mainly able at the moment as a parish priest to engage with deconstructing whiteness is in continually challenging my own and other people's assumptions in ways that I hope are formative. So assumptions about where knowledge comes from and what knowledge is of value. Assumptions about what wisdom looks like, assumptions about whose voices are worth listening to, assumptions about who is in the room and who isn't, assumption about how power functions and how power changes us, because it does. And assumptions about what is normative. Again, it's that generic universalism, that sort of really insidious tendency to normalize whiteness. It's gradual work, but I hope it is transformative. I believe it is transformative because it is building on that revelation that is leading us more and more into truth, I think, as we grapple with this stuff. We will mess up, we do mess up, and we need to hold up our hands when we do. But there's something really important about engaging consistently and in formative and habit-forming ways in that transformative work of deconstructing whiteness, which points us more and more towards the fullness of the justice and peace of God's kingdom. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. Today, it might be different if you ask me on another day.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you for connecting it so closely with local level church life, parish life, where actually ultimately all of our faith-rooted justice making has to have an impact, as Anthony said in the introduction. So I'm sure we will talk more about that. Well, and also the concept of formation and what that means, because this is about, it's this sort of iterative process, isn't it? And I like the notion of consistency. And I'm not sure you use the word honesty, but being, if we're going to be honest about when we've messed up or could have done better, or we have to have sort of communities where we feel able to do that, and communities where we feel able to learn from one another. So thank you for that. I'm going to bring in Angela next, Angela Sheard, who is also a curate at St Martin's in the Fields. And I think, Angela, you're also a co-convener of the UKME Curates and Ordinands group. And you can tell us anything else about yourself that you think is appropriate for this conversation. But thank you for joining us, and great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Alison. It's great to be here. I think for me, and I might be speaking out of from a slightly different place to the contributions that have come so far, deconstructing whiteness fits into something even bigger, the deconstructing of race itself. This is a theme which has emerged a lot in my own life over the last few years, as I've explored and tried to understand my own racial identity. And the death of George Floyd and the renewal of the Black Lives Matter movement has been mentioned already, but it was really the starting point of the journey for me. So I guess I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about myself, so you know where I'm coming from. I have a white English father and a Sri Lankan Tamil mother. I grew up in Tooting, southwest London, which is to this day a fairly multicultural area with a large South Asian community. I grew up spending time in and around this community. There were plenty of other mixed people at my school, and I had always defined myself as mixed without question. At the same time, though, I think I've always known that I've been what some people would refer to as white passing. I have an English sounding name, a British accent, and I grew up in this country. My skin color is broadly olive, and so while many people often ask me, where are you from, and guess locations all over the world and speak to me in many different languages, many people also assume that I'm white British. In other words, I'm regularly identified as both white and as non-white. It was the renewal of the Black Lives Matter movement that caused me to really reflect on the implications of this for myself and for my relationship to the church. At the time of George Floyd's murder, the UK was in lockdown, and I was living in my college accommodation. From my room at Theological College, I can remember writing blog posts and assignments which were focused on those protests from the perspective of the UK white majority church. But I hesitated on where I stood in relation to this white majority. Was I part of it? Or was I on the outside looking in? When I referred to white people within the church, did I mean them or us? Later that same year, I studied Black theology more formally, and at Queen's we explored the work of theologians from the US, the UK, and the Caribbean, among other contexts. I absolutely loved the module. I loved engaging with their work. I genuinely think it was transformative for me. But I struggled a lot more with the small group tasks in which we had to speak from our own perspective. In one sense, I identified as white, and so I was able to clearly locate myself within the discourse. And I think it's really important to locate my own racial identity as privileged in comparison with so many people. However, my identity as a whole didn't clearly point in that direction. So if I portrayed myself as white, I could enter the discourse at the expense of strangely downplaying a part of who I was. It felt like the theological world we were engaging with didn't leave space for uncertainty and confusion around racial identity. Knowing whether you were white or black or neither seemed like an essential prerequisite. I found myself wondering how my own experience could coexist with racial category descriptors such as white, Asian, black, or even the very commonly used UK minority ethnic / global majority heritage. Where did a mixed identity fit within these descriptors, which are so essential to modern anti-racism and to discourse around racial justice in the Church of England? I think that the category descriptors remain helpful in describing the reality of institutional racism in the Church of England, something which is both acknowledged and also contested. Racism and its toxic effects are real, and we need contextual Black, Asian, and other global majority world theologies which describe racial oppression as chains of sin, which must be broken by God the Liberator. However, I think it's also important to recognize how racial identity cannot fit into the boxes that we provide, but is so often fragmentary, fluid, dynamic. These are two different ways of conceptualizing race, and I think that they're both important for the racial discourse of the church. They need to be held in tension without trying to force them into a single normative interpretation of reality. As much as whiteness can be considered normative, so I think can our conventional racial categories. This most uncomfortable tension then is, I think, a deconstruction of the hegemony of race. But I think it's also a deconstruction of whiteness because it challenges the seemingly ontological or essential boundary between white and non-white. Indeed, more than this, it challenges the Christianity which developed in the expansionist period of the history of Western Europe and which ultimately created the modern hierarchy of race, which continues to damage us today. So, deconstructing whiteness, deconstructing race is important to me because I think that in order for our church to be truly free of racism, I think we must become truly free of race. And so I think that it would be liberatory to create space in our racial discourse somehow for people of mixed heritage to explore how they see God as people whose identities sit in between these conventional racial categories. In many ways, this process is already happening, as mixed theologians are now beginning to create new theologies which explore what a mixed God and a mixed people of God might look like and how they relate to one another. These, I think, are theologies which dare to imagine someday a new community rising with courage from the ashes of race. So, as Ruth said, that's what I think right now. But who knows? Ask me again tomorrow.
Angela, thank you so much. Yes, well, you've outlined a really powerful agenda, which I'm sure we will come back to. Just so everybody knows, I've invited, after each person has spoken, each person to then respond to something they've heard which they've found challenging or fruitful or whatever. So this whole concept of what is race anyway, and what is normative, and what categories are normative, and is that part of the problem from a mixed perspective. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your personal experience as well, Angela, which I am sure we will engage with some more, but thank you. So finally, Al Barrett, who is a vicar in Hodge Hill in Birmingham and has written widely on a range of issues of around issues of mission, and people may well know his book With Ruth, Being Interrupted, which I know from my own experience has proved incredibly helpful and fruitful in conversations around mission and community issues. So Al, great to have you with us, and interested to hear how I know everything you do relates to everything else. So really how the deconstructing whiteness aspect of your holistic kind of worldview, how it fits. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And thank you everyone else who's gone before me. It's a privilege to go last. Ruth mentioned formation, and I think I want to pick up a related word, discipleship, because I think one of the things that I want to name in terms of deconstructing whiteness, or being involved in deconstructing whiteness as a white person, is a following after. I first encountered Black theology when I was training for ordained ministry 22, 23 years ago. And as others have said, particularly Carol and Anthony in their introductions, this is not a beginning, this thing that's emerging at the moment. It's a belated awakening for white Christians and white theologians, as Anthony said, not to anti-racist activism, but to a reflexivity around our whiteness, as Angela said, to a deconstruction of race itself. Whiteness and race, not just around us, but also in us and in me. And I'm conscious, not just as part of this sort of collective awakening among white people far too late in the day, but also the belatedness within me and on my journey. And I think I just want to illustrate that with a story that I've told in one or two places before. But a couple of years after I became vicar in Hodge Hill, in an ethnically diverse community, a church community, majority white, but with a significant minority, particularly from a Caribbean heritage when I arrived. I heard a story from one of my Caribbean heritage members of their exclusion and removal from lay ministry and leadership in this church community many years before. And there were two things that happened in that moment for me. One was the shock of hearing that story, which I had not heard before, and I had not been aware of that bit of the history before that moment. And you know, I knew about racism in church communities, but actually to hear about it in my church community was a shock. But I think as I processed it further, the deeper shock was that actually it had taken me 2 years to hear that story. And actually it was an awakening, not just to racism as part of the history of this church community, but to my own obliviousness, to the questions that I hadn't asked, or the conversations that I hadn't sat in long enough and attentive enough to have heard that story before that moment. And I think for me, that has been a profoundly formative moment in realizing some of the key dynamics of whiteness, because as others have said, it thrives on its own invisibility. It thrives on keeping white people oblivious of the fact that it is immensely powerful. It thrives on keeping Black suffering unnoticed and unheard by those of us who are white. And so I think for me, one of the key things that has happened locally for me and my church community and fellow members here has been a releasing of those stories. Not that those stories were not told in some places before now, but we have started telling them to each other. And I'm really conscious for my Black siblings here of the potential for re-traumatizing that storytelling yet again can have. And I'm really conscious of the courage and deep strength it has taken for some of my Black siblings to tell those stories yet again. But there has been a sense of opening up for us as a church community in that. And another part of that has been reading together the book Ghost Ship by Azariah France Williams, which has enabled our little stories to find a place in a bigger story, not just the big story of race and the invention of race through empire and slavery, but but also the big but not quite as big story of race and the Church of England, and the way in which whiteness has undergirded and shaped the culture and the structures and the foundational assumptions of the church, which pays my stipend, on which I depend for my livelihood. And for us as a church community, particularly for our white members, to be able to discover that story and to locate ourselves within it has been profoundly important. I think the last thing I want to say for the moment is that shortly after the wonderful book edited by Anthony and Carol arrived on my doorstep, another one arrived, which was by Kahindi Andrews, The Psychosis of Whiteness. And it's not been published for very long, and I've been reading it very quickly. But as a white person invested in these conversations of dismantling whiteness, it's a profoundly uncomfortable book to read, because Professor Andrews names what he calls the anti-racism industrial complex. And I worry that those of us who are white invested in these kind of conversations can very easily slip into that anti-racism industrial complex and actually, at worst, make a living out of this. And what I don't want to do is to be complicit in white people, including me, making a living out of this. One of the lines that Professor Andrews uses in the book, which I find profoundly helpful, he says, you can't train racism out of people, let alone institutions. He attacks any sense that this stays at the level of those of us as individuals, waking up to our whiteness and kind of then engaging in kind of self-help processes. He says the only solution to the problem of racism is revolution. And actually, I think, yes, I'm up for being part of dismantling whiteness within theology, within academia, within the church. But ultimately, if we're talking about whiteness and its entanglement with patriarchy and capitalism as well, actually what we really need is the bringing down of the institutions on which some of us depend for our livelihood.
Thank you, Al. That's another whole set of agendas there. Thank you for highlighting that other book as well. I should say that when you read, if you haven't already, Deconstructing Whiteness, there will be so many books that you want to read in addition as a result of reading it, that we set ourselves. I mean, I've lost count of the books. I feel I need to get that, I need to read that, I need to read that. It is really, as we say, it's an opening up of a whole fertile area for thinking, reflecting, for conversation, and it is limitless, really. But Al, I'm particularly struck by that sense of storytelling again at the local level, but being aware of how, and we may come back to this, what is the best way? Because we've had two comments, just so everybody knows so far, one from Vala and one from Fiona Macmillan, really asking the question about, is there a kind of, well, in Vala's case, it would be great if there was a kind of theological educational module on critical whiteness, not so people can feel like they've done it and we've done enough, but to make a start. And Fiona asks about toolkits for parishes. Now, I'm feeling that's a whole other area which but can we sort of think about that as we go forward on this call, about what it might look like, what the, not so much the content, I guess, but the processes might look like. So I'll just pitch that out there as based on two comments we've had, but also on what you've begun to explore, both Al and Ruth, about the local parish level engagements. So I would now like to invite each person to speak to, fairly briefly, something you've heard from someone else on the call, that you thought, yes, or don't know about that, or something that struck you anyway, particularly powerfully, that you'd like to maybe pick up, pitch in as something we need to explore more, or ask that person a direct question? And I think, to be fair, we'll do it in the same order, if that's okay. So Carol, if I could go to you first, what have you heard that you want to just sort of note or explore?
Well, there was loads there. There's so much there. And what Al's last statement was pretty powerful. But linked to that, I suppose, what Ruth said, because of the way my mind works. And this isn't to dismiss, and it would be stupid of me to do that because that's where I'm working, to dismiss the importance of academic theology and the study of it, whatever. But Ruth actually talking about being in parish and actually trying to do work with people in the church and beyond, because to me, church that only deals with the people of the church isn't really, doing its full work. If you're talking about transformation, it's transformation for everybody. If you're talking about liberation, it's liberation for everybody, not just those that go to church. So I found that powerful, what you said about, trying to bring about this transformation, because not to offend all the ministers here, but I have no confidence in the church as an institution to bring about any great change, because it's not in the interests of the institution to do that. Revolution isn't in the interests of the church as an institution, but it's those pockets of people, communities, churches, church families, church groups who are doing the work where they're at. That is so important, because it's actually, there's potential for change there, there's potential for transformation there in those pockets of people that decide that, yeah, this is something I want to try to do. And you may not always do it right, but at least you're trying. So I think that speaks to me, because it's important on the ground level. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That's really important, isn't it? Because it raises a question about starting the conversation. And how do we start the conversation? But then also, I guess, for me, how do we then make sure that whatever is started receives challenges from beyond and doesn't just become what it is in one place, if that makes sense? Where does the discipline and the challenge come from? And we've had a question about the sense of, there's so many spaces in the church where whiteness is not, in terms of personhood and racial identity, is not just the majority, but often the whole. So what's the difference between addressing this in a context like ours, where you do have a significant number of people from more diverse backgrounds, or the difference between that and a wholly white congregation? So that might be something we want to come back to. So thank you, Carol, for that. Professor Reddie.
Please do call me Anthony. I'm only professor to the people I don't like. So Anthony's fine. I want to pick up on something that Angela said, really, because it reminded me of my entry into this work. So in 1994, there was the first Black Theology Forum met at the then Celio colleges, and the chair was a Methodist minister from the Caribbean, George Mulred, and along with Larty. And one of the earliest conversations we had, if not the first and second, then certainly the second meeting, was by meeting as Black people in order to develop a fledgling movement of Black theology in Britain, were we not in danger of simply reinscribing the very nature of race that we were trying to deconstruct? Because there's a sense in which whiteness as this supposedly solid, fixed identity of oppression exists. And then therefore what Black people have tried to do is to find a Black liberative model that still kind of works on some of the assumptions of race, but just on the flip side. And so were we not in danger of reinscribing that? And the thing we wrestle with that has never been resolved intellectually. So just, you know, I'm just a bit of a shout out there, Angela, that I certainly sort of see a PhD on the horizon for you. And it may be that like you want to tackle like this big insoluble question, which is, how can you get at anti-racist activism without reinscribing or reinserting the very foundations of race? Or to put it another way, is it possible to take race out of the equation but then still be able to do anti-racist work? Because one of the reasons why we still talk about race is how then do you analyze like the very thing that is given rise to oppressive systems and practices and structures and procedures and policies? Those things are real, they don't fall out the ether. There is, you know, there are structures and systems that have been given life and sustenance because of the idea of race. So how then you then trying to fight it without reasserting the very thing that you're trying to overturn is something that people have been wrestling with for decades, and there's been big books have been written about it. And I think it's an ongoing challenge, you know, and I think one of the key things therefore about this notion of mix or mixing, certainly within post-colonial theology, people talk about hybridity, still a problematic notion in some regards, are ways of trying to disturb this notion of fixed categories, or this sense that like there's some boxes that all of us kind of fit into and you have to fit into a box. And if there's anything we know about humanity is that we are much more complex than that. And we, I think, trouble any categories of tick box exercises of trying to categorize us in particular ways. So I think the issue that you raise are huge ones. And I think what we're hopefully trying to do in Deconstructing Whiteness as a book is to go back and say, well, actually, by deconstructing whiteness, what we're trying to do is to unsettle the very premise around how these hierarchies have operated and the way in which these categories have functioned. And hopefully by trying to get at what has often been an invisible phenomena that has not been spoken of, then hopefully that may well be hopefully a key to beginning to unlock this very complex mechanism actually called racism.
Thank you, Anthony. I like the subtle way in which you suggested a PhD there for Angela. That's not a professorial thing to do. I don't know what it is. Ruth, what's your thinking? What's struck you?
A huge number of things struck me listening to that, but I want to go back and pick up on something actually that Carol said right at the beginning in introducing the book and the project and where it had emerged from. And Carol, I think you described it as a moment in theological thinking and practice, and I think that's a really helpful phrase to hang on to. This is a moment. And you also said something about how important it is to build on this. And Anthony, you said something very similar about this being part of a movement and practice. And I think that idea of building on something is a really, really crucial one for all of us who are engaged in this kind of work to hang on to. One of these other areas of work that I spend a lot of my time in is around feminist theologies and feminist ecclesiology. And one of the concepts that I come across time and time again in that field and in feminist studies more generally is this idea of knowledge dipping below the surface. And that's not accidental. Feminist knowledge dips below the surface. And that's because one of the functions of patriarchy is that it reasserts itself. And in the same way, I think both black knowledge and critical white knowledge dip below the surface very easily, because that's one of the ways that whiteness reasserts itself. So I think I just want us to keep at the forefront of our minds that idea of this being a moment, and that idea of it being something to build on. Because I think that helps us not to get into a fixed mindset of, well, you know, we can frame this and then we can work out where we're going with it. But also it helps us not to take for granted the progress, however small and however slow, that we are making. It's so easy for this kind of knowledge to dip below the surface again. And I think part of that then for me, one of the ways that I want to be addressing that is by asking those bigger questions, those bigger sort of epistemological questions of what do we mean when we say knowledge? What kind of knowledge are we counting as valid and worthy and interesting and all of those things? And how are we broadening, just continually pushing the boundaries out of what we mean by knowledge? What are we valuing in the knowledge that we are allowing to form us as individuals and as church communities? And how are we keeping that building process going? So not a huge amount of answer in that, but just an observation about the importance of seeing this as a moment within a process and a conversation, rather than either an end point or a starting point, really.
Thank you, Ruth. And it strikes me that is where the connection is, isn't it? Between ourselves as disciples, as Al was saying, our life in community as Christian community, and the thinking and the theory and the thing that impacts and is impacted by those things, because the knowledge or the revolution of constructing an imagination where everybody's knowledge is important and everybody's embodied contextual knowledge is equally important, and that the role of the Christian community is, as Al was saying, to be able to collect those stories, to hear those stories, for those stories of people's stories to impact upon one another. And inevitably, sorry, I'm abusing the chair maybe, but inevitably those stories reveal much more diversity than we would ever expect just from looking at people from the outside. Somebody in the chat has used the phrase homogenous daily lives around white majority communities, but actually how homogenous really are homogenous daily lives if we get to know the reality of other people's lives within our community. I think there's a lot of hidden diversity within whiteness, within blackness, within mixedness. Anyway, that's just sort of trying to tie a few things together that are emerging. Angela, I know you want to respond directly to what Anthony said just now, which is fine, as well as having your space to reflect on something additional that might have come up before Anthony responded to the responses. So over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Alison. I mean, yeah, once again, so much richness in all of the contributions this evening. I think, Anthony, I feel like you really kind of phrased it so well in describing the kind of the issue around how do we sort of somehow hold together the need for kind of racial categories in certain ways and to act on them, but then also the need to break out of them and the need to acknowledge that identity cannot be put into boxes. So I really appreciated your formulation of that. And I guess, I don't have any easy answers, but I kind of think that, I don't know if this is possible, but I think it would be really helpful in the church to be able to acknowledge that actually there are different ways of conceptualizing how we understand ethnicity, how we understand race, how we understand heritage. There are different ways of conceptualizing it. We can think about it in terms of categories, and sometimes that's really helpful. For example, when we're describing structures, so when we're describing institutional racism, categories are really helpful in helping us in that conversation. But then on the other hand, when we're talking about people's individual stories, that form, it's just less helpful to talk about categories, and it's more helpful to acknowledge the power of story and fluidity of story for maybe and the kind of fragmentary and sometimes contradictory nature of the stories that people tell about who they are. So I don't know, that's kind of my thoughts on it at the moment. But the thing that I wanted to pick up from the kind of original contributions was from something Al said near the end about The Psychosis of Whiteness, which sounds like a really incredible book. And that quote, like the anti-racism industrial complex, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And it really got me thinking about how kind of diversity can often be treated as if it's a commodity. And not only that, but it's like this kind of rare and precious resource. And so much of the time, I think our thinking around diversity can actually inadvertently follow a kind of capitalistic framework without us even realizing it. Like, you know, where like certain people possess diversity and we effectively need to own those people by giving them, by making sure that people know they're part of our organization. And it becomes a kind of, I don't know, it becomes this sense of we need to grow in diversity, but that's it's in quite a kind of acquisitorial phrasing. So yeah, it really made me reflect on that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Angela. I think that's a really important point, which we should come back to. Acquisitorial is a great word. I'm going to write it down. But let me go to Al for his reflections on the other contributions.
Thank you. And again, following after everyone else, having written down something that I wanted to respond to, there's now a million other things as well. And actually, I think, Angela, your last point about commodifying, that's one of the dynamics of whiteness, again, is to kind of that sense of extraction that empire and colonialism highlighted so readily, and actually has not gone away. It's just morphed into different forms. I think what I wanted to tease out a little bit more, again, Angela, was from your first contribution, where you ended by pointing us towards a new community rising from the ashes of race. And I think I want to kind of name my excitement and my hopefulness for that, but also my profound caution that I, as a white person, might have anything to say in terms of describing what that new community might look like. And I think to just unpack that a little bit more, one of the things that Ruth and I try and do in our chapter in this book is, and it's responding to a provocation from Willie James Jennings, who has been one of the immensely formative voices in this recent conversation about whiteness. He talks about, in his book After Whiteness, he talks about the crowd. And he pushes at what he calls the facilitating obsession of whiteness. The need for those of us who are white to be involved constantly in the convening, in the bringing together, and imagining that that's something of our gift or our role or our contribution. And what he says in immensely poetic but powerful language is that white people need to learn to release ourselves to the crowd. And Ruth and I, in our chapter, try and work out something of what he means by that. And one of the ways in which we do that is by by trying to name what we call a white-initiated thrown togetherness and a God-initiated thrown togetherness. And of course, one of the other things that whiteness often does is put ourselves in the position of God and imagine that those two things are the same thing. And I think one of the profound challenges of Black theology and of the moment that we're in now in this conversation is that white people desperately need to learn that they are not in the position of God, and that there is a movement of bringing together where we at best as white people are invited late to a party. And so I think one of the things I'm interested in the midst of the revolution, in the midst of the crumbling of the institutions that those of us who are white are kind of invested in and imagine our reality, is noticing where the parties are happening that actually have nothing to do with us hosting or convening or facilitating, and not assuming that we have any kind of guaranteed invitation or entitlement to be there, because again, that's part of the dynamics of whiteness. But as I think Gerald Robertson Brown articulated fairly recently in a powerful lecture, actually one of the things going on in all of this is a transformation of our desire. And for those of us who are white, I think I want my desire to be transformed into a desire that wants to be at those parties, but doesn't want to be hosting them.
Wow, thank you, Al. All of those contributions have been really powerful. Thank you so much. And it raises so many aspects. My initial response to all of that is it feels as though there's a renewed sense that the local, to go back to where we started, the local might be the place where it's easier, or it's not easier, it's more appropriate to make some of the to do some of this work around the transformation of desire, which I recognize is a result of something. It's not something you try to do, but some of the things we've been talking about, the storytelling, the uncovering a diversity not as a commodity but as a new way of seeing one another, some of those things, it feels like to me, and I'd be interested in what you think about the national level, not that they're not important, but some of the national level initiatives which shift and change from anti-racism programs to unconscious bias training to, and Anthony will be involved in that will know of you are involved in the Anglican whatever it's called now, initiative, the Paul Boateng chaired one, and the Methodist EDI process. You kind of think it's just your head starts to explode about what exactly is it we're trying to do again, and I wonder whether the relational local, which in itself is a challenge, might be a more fertile place to start, and also might be a task that we can embrace as transformative theologically, which might be a lot more true to the gospel than some of the things that we're supposed to be engaging with, like church growth, for instance. Would anybody like to? Anthony, you're nodding. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting dilemma. that I would think often is to go for top-down, large, I guess, initiatives. So the Archbishop's Racial Justice Commission, on which I'm on, is one such example. So, you know, it's like you get the great and the good in one room, and we sit and we pore over bits of paper and stuff. And whilst I think it's well-meaning, and I don't wish to dismiss it, not least of all the fact that I've invested 2 years of my life in it with another year to go. I mean, that's 2 years of my life. I'll never get that. It's necessary, but I think the truth is, and I think I want to pick up on something that Carol said earlier, that all that will be in vain if there's not the grassroots movement that then helps to push those initiatives into sustained action. That I think what history shows us is that radical revolutionary change is always bottom up, never top down. And so it's not that the larger initiatives done by our different institutions are not important, but they're only important insofar as that they are on the back of the kind of conscientizing work that needs to happen at a local level that is rooted in relationships and reciprocity, and in people being committed to living out change. When those movements kickstart and when there is a grassroots kind of almost like rebellion, so to speak, then the top-down stuff then comes into play. But at the moment, what we tend to happen is that, like, we do the top-down stuff without any commitment to how we're resourcing what really needs to happen at the grassroots.
Thank you. And Al, I just wanted to ask you, because you spoke in your initial input about the storytelling you've been doing in your local church and the smaller stories that are part of a bigger story. And I wondered, was that amongst white people about their whiteness and the place in the bigger story? And how did it feel for you and for them to engage in that? Was it liberatory? Was it uncomfortable? Was it a mix of those things? What was it like?
Yeah, and all of those things and more. And I think, I mean, Angela named it sharply tonight in a way that I don't think I've ever been able to name it quite as articulately, around kind of commodifying diversity. But we were conscious that actually we didn't want this to be just our Black congregation members telling their stories again, so that those of us who are white could be enriched by them, or even challenged by them. That felt important, but actually it felt just as important to push our white members, including me, to do work that maybe some of us had never done before, to tell our story of what it means to be a white person, because whiteness doesn't want us to do that. And so, yeah, they were profoundly uncomfortable moments and conversations. But slowly there's a liberation with that, because you know, it is, as Ruth said right at the beginning, it is an apocalyptic, revelatory kind of moment. You receive a grace from without, from our human others in the room, but from the divine other, the Spirit working amongst us, that you suddenly realize this crap is not true. You know, the stuff that we've invested our lives and livelihoods in is ridiculous. It's a fiction. And once you begin to realize that, actually the possibility of being open to the Spirit at work, calling us into Angela's new community rising from the ashes of race, suddenly becomes the whole point of being a Christian and following Jesus. And that's quite exciting. We've only glimpsed moments of it in our chill, but those moments have been amazing.
Thank you, Ruth. I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, can I pick up? I was going to sort of make this point anyway, but Al, I'm going to build on what you've said, and Angela as well, what you've been saying. I think what you're describing there, Al, is renewal. And I think I'm very much here for us talking about revolution, and we need one. But I want to couch that as well in spiritual terms. Not that revolution itself can't be a spiritual activity, because I absolutely think it can. But I want to say something about renewal. I think renewal is also a grassroots thing. Renewal does not come from the top. And renewal has to mean something transformative. It has to mean that sort of fresh outpouring of the Holy Spirit that is leading us more and more into truth. And by leading us into truth is making us recognize all that crap, as Al has just described it, for what it is. As Gloria Steinem puts it, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And that willingness to enter spaces that are both liberative and discomforting is really key. And I think one of the things that whiteness has done to us who are white, and for us, and particularly whiteness within the church, is has somehow convinced us that that being comfortable is a marker of something being good or right. And we see that in all sorts of ways. We see it in ways that we frame discernment. We see it in ways that we frame all sorts of things. And I think unlearning that, being willing to say that actually discomfort, where that discomfort is born out of a revelation of all this crap that we have been part of, discomfort is good and holy and formational. That I think is really key for us.
Thank you. That's and I'm going to bring in Angela because she's nodding a lot.
I mean, I've probably been nodding non-stop for the last 20 minutes or something. But I think that thing about discomfort feels really central to me. And I kind of think it sets the groundwork for starting conversations around this kind of thing in local churches. That's my kind of sense about it, because I think it's probably one of the biggest barriers, because I think church can often be a place where people who need comfort are very understandably looking for it. But as a result, I think, of people looking for that and people wanting to provide that comfort, people who need discomfort can't receive it in that environment. And so the big question is really, for me, like putting that out in the open and seeing how people respond to the idea of being discomforted, and all of the, raises many questions, I think, in a church setting. But for me, that is the essential groundwork before you can start to have a conversation around exploring people's own stories and really breaking down people's sense of who they are and identity.
Thank you. Yes, and I guess it raises the question about the relationship between discomfort and comfort, and sometimes the things that we think make ourselves comfortable, or that we assume make other people comfortable, ultimately are not. That it may be a surface comfort, it may be a superficial comfort, it may be, a corner cutting comfort, but where's comfort spoken of as a gospel value? Isn't it something else that should be going on there, which I think is much more what we've been talking about this evening, where the deep levels of sharing that will involve, and I think this is clear in the book, the book talks about the need to be disturbed and for discomfort to have particularly for those of us who are white, to have a sense of discomfort. But ultimately, if our connections are more authentic and deep as a result of that, then that may bring with it a different kind of comfort. We've got 10 minutes left, and I'd like to just make sure that everybody has said what they would like to say, and we go out of this call on a sense of bringing together some key things that we've learned. So the best way to do that is to ask you to talk about one key thing that you think you might take away from this conversation. So can I go around again? I'm sorry, that means, Carol, I'm springing it on you with if I ask you first, but are you happy to say something, one key thing you're taking away from this conversation?
I don't know if I'm happy, but because there's so much there. I think it's encouraging to see that there are people that are thinking about these things and trying to do something, not just talk about it. I'm a bit disillusioned with church, so it's nice to know that there are places where things are happening that are more positive, more transformative, more liberative. Because, as I said, it's good that we've done the book, but it's about the actual action and practice. So the fact that there is somewhere, or there are places where these things are happening, is encouraging, but can't rest on our laurels and just think everything's going to be fine. It's, as we've said already, it's an ongoing process.
Oops, I was on mute, I think. What's your one thing, Anthony, that you'll be taking from this conversation?
I think for me, it's a hopeful sense that there are white allies and colleagues who are serious about doing this work and have hopefully enough reflexivity to be aware of the dangers as they're undertaking that. Again, going way back into the midst of time when we had our early Black theology conference forums and then the conferences. I remember someone saying, I think it might have been Robert Beckford. So he did a book, God and the Gangs, 2004, and in that there was a chapter on whiteness, which probably one of the earliest bits of work on whiteness. And one of the things he said was, well, white people need to meet together in order to deconstruct whiteness, but can we trust them to do it properly? Because if simply meeting as white people was a criteria for change, then, they've been meeting for centuries, actually, without us here. But it's never been liberative. So can they be trusted to meet together and do the work? In 1994, I don't think any of us actually could have imagined that happening. I think I'm much more hopeful now.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely crucial question. And I don't want to speak for Al and Ruth, but my own sense is I'm not sure we can still be trusted. We need it to be a conversation, but we need to know what work is ours to do that Black theologians can't do for us, or mixed theologians can't do for us. That would be my two penneth on that. But let me go to Ruth to say what one thing you're taking away this evening, Ruth.
Yeah, I think for me, keeping my eye always on that word that Anthony has just used, liberative. That's where we're heading. That's what we need to be doing and being. And I think within that, one of the things I'm really aware that I need to be cultivating in myself and hopefully in the community that I'm part of locally is a deep attentiveness, kind of attentiveness to whiteness, yes, but more broadly as well and more deeply to those premises of hierarchy and category that Angela named so articulately earlier, and the need to unsettle those things. We can't unsettle them unless we're willing to name them, and we can't name them unless we're attentive to them. So I think for me it is yet again that call to a kind of deep attentiveness to how that tangled web of whiteness and all the things that go with it, capitalism and patriarchy and hierarchy, how that is entangled in my own life and the life of the community that I am trying to serve and live among. Naming that as a first step to working against it and pushing back in those small formative ways that I was naming at the beginning.
Thank you, Ruth. Angela, your one thing.
Okay, I think my one thing is around, it's around this kind of conversation that's been going on around revolution and renewal. And I've been sort of asking myself, as I've been sitting here, kind of how far does whiteness go? In the sense of like how much of my kind of life and culture and faith, how much of the stuff which I consider really core and really central, even stuff around how I see Christianity and my beliefs and practices, how much of that was formed by whiteness? How many of the things which I consider to be totally fundamental, how many of those were created by whiteness? And I think it's a very kind of, yeah, it's a very disturbing and searching kind of question, but I kind of think, yeah, I feel really motivated to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Al.
I think I'm going away with a renewed eschatology. And I think for me tonight, that is at least twofold. There is the hope and the promise of a new community where these deadly methods are dissolved and dismantled and past. But there's also an in the meantime. And it feels like actually that work of in the meantime, where we need, as Ruth said, to remain attentive to those categories that we know are not true, that we know don't have ultimate hold on any of us, but for the moment, we know they still exert great power. To be able to kind of hold that not yet, but also now in that space with both hope, but also laser sharp clarity, in a work that kind of needs to be together across our differences, but also knows that those differences are not yet entirely breached and dissolved. It's kind of, yeah, let's live in that space.
Thank you so much. It's time to finish, but Anthony, you started off raising the question about the need for us to become a different kind of church, and the question, how can deconstructing whiteness and the agenda that we've explored this evening enable us? It needs to enable us to be a different kind. It needs to impact on the way we are being church. And I think what we've explored this evening is some really deep and profound deeply theological issues around, I mean, we've used a lot of theological phrases, even, revelation, apocalypse, eschatology, We've talked about discipleship, we've talked about mission, and this is a really, that I love the fact that it's been such a deeply theological conversation, engaging with something which is geopolitically and politically so important as well. So I want to thank Ruth and Carol and Anthony and Angela and Al for all of your contributions and the way that you all interrelated with one another. That was fantastic. I want to thank the people who contributed from YouTube, and I hope I worked those things in very subtly that you were saying. And if you are inspired by this way of doing theology and this approach, then please do, as I said at the beginning, please do keep in touch with Modern Church. We have another panel coming up on November the 9th, focusing on another book, which is called Confounding the Mighty, looking at social class and theology. And that I know will also be really engaging and fascinating on another really important set of issues. So thank you all. And that's it.